From I Am Interchange, it's the Eco Nomic Futures podcast. This is episode 2. It was recorded at the Eco Nomic Futures gathering in San Francisco. Not a conference exactly, more of a meeting point. A place where different conversations cross paths about food, land, economics, and what happens when systems lose their connection to life. I'm Tate Chamberlin. In this episode, I'm joined by Huhn and Warinkwi Flores. And if you haven't listened to the episode before this one, the First Nations Economic Compact, it helps explain the ground this conversation is standing on. This episode is called BioCulture. It's about systems, the ones we live inside now, and the ones that came before them. Indigenous economies didn't treat land, food, or water as commodities. They were relational systems, connected to life, responsibility, and continuity. Those systems weren't replaced because they failed. They were interrupted by the doctrine of discovery, by economic models built on extraction and ownership. From there, the story moves into the present. We talk about how living things become products, how they're manipulated and transformed, moved through supply chains so long and familiar they feel invisible. Food makes us tangible. Corn moves through the conversation, not as a subject, but as a way to see how meaning gets stripped away as things move faster and farther from their origins. We also talk about data, what gets measured, what gets ignored, how modern economies trust numbers, often without asking who controls them, or what stories they leave out, and how data, when grounded in indigenous values, can become a tool for stewardship rather than extraction. We talk about the rights of nature, about nourishment, agency, wealth, and sovereignty. About economies that don't sit apart from life, but are embedded within it. This is a story about food in motion, from fields to trucks to stores to tables. But it's also about something deeper, about restoring indigenous economies that understand movement as relationship, data as care, and life as something to be honored, not extracted. A reminder that the future isn't something we have to invent from scratch. In many ways, it's something we already know how to return to. Stay with us. Hey you two, welcome. What does a bioeconomy mean to you?
You can define it really as academics. We can define it from the academics. Bioeconomy, it comes from applied economies. How do we apply the economical theory into agricultural products? Often, that's how bioeconomy is. So let's say that we are growing corn. Okay, corn can be used just as a corn meal. You ground it, you eat it, or you can feed the whole corn to the livestock. So that is not necessarily something that we will consider a bioeconomy. That's a direct economic transaction. Bioeconomy started becoming as when we take corn and we put it through a process and becomes fuel, biofuel, or we put it into a process and become a plastic. So at that moment, there is an added value to the same product. And the additional value, we can now equate that. The economy that came from a nature dependency. It came from the organic material of transforming corn into corn syrup, corn into biofuel, corn into plastics. So it's the addition of value through a process of manipulation in a chain reaction. And we end up with an added value product that is higher than the original value. So a pound of corn could be $1.50. Corn syrup, now it can value $5, it can value $7, it can value $10. However, the market is valuing that added value. And now in there is where we are trying to move a lot of things. How do we create added value to agricultural products and also agricultural waste? How do we add the added value to those things such that it becomes more part of the economical stream? However, then there is another way to think about bioeconomy. The other way is thinking about what is our relational approach to how we are manipulating these products. For instance, corn for many local communities and indigenous people, it holds spirit. It holds cultural identity. So for them, transforming in the sense of just adding value, economical value, is a way of disaggregating the spirituality, the cultural identity in the process. So they often has a better way of thinking about what corn can we use to make it into transactions, into a relational good, a relational service. So there is a big difference when we're thinking about what is the standard way of thinking about bioeconomy and what will be the alternative parallel of the bioeconomy, primarily when it comes through the lenses of right now we are in Eco Nomic Futures. If it's coming from that understanding of cultural identity, cultural values, then we are talking more about the relational goods and services. So the added value is not about maximization of the corn, it's adding really a cultural process. So a blue corn, it becomes a cornmeal, and the cornmeal could become a baby food that really is meant to nourish the baby. It's not about passing through a mechanical disaggregation of the molecules into sugars, into carbohydrates to fatten the kid, but rather is passing down from a handmade to a place that is easy to access to a place that's ready to be distributed to the family. So it's a relational service and a relational goods that we might need to start thinking about. What is the parallels when we think about bioeconomy from these two world views that we need to start considering?
Jakob, I think that you fit into this topic as a relational good with the work that you're doing with Moss House.
Moos is the German word for moss in English. So moss. It was a ancient being with a soft quality that was giving the name for a little urban village that we've been cultivating, through which we met originally, and which definitely was following a theory of change that I heard from Nora Bateson that's just called relationships that inform relationships that build. And you can continue. The beautiful part of doing a project which is not just for one sector, not for one community, is that you can build alliances and support movements for wider social cohesion, but also for the way how we can create a culture. We can shape our places if we build up a sense of agency. Best we can build up a sense of agency if we do it together. And that's where I'm interested in projects that combine the nourishment of the people, of the food, with the health of their relations and their places, but also shape local visions to be stewards of land. And that's why I'm sitting along here together, because I'm interested to hear your bioregional sort of local visions.
Yeah, biocultural regionality. I think that's you're getting at the level of how do we bring this, how do we connect the fractal systems that are within these relations. And that to us has been really thinking about not a bioregion, because a bioregion, once again, it either distort our vision that we are above the bioregion. So we are manipulating or engineering the bioregion. But rather it will be a biocultural regionality, meaning the biological diversity has shaped the culture, and the cultural diversity has shaped the biological diversity. It doesn't work one or the other one. It works in parallel. They are complementary opposite forces that they are working together. Neither are they in coexistence. They are in existence. There's a big miss that we often do when we remove ourselves from the responsibility, or we include ourselves too much in the notion of this is a human-centered design. Very quickly, the nature is not part of it. It's just the relationship between you and I as the homo species or homo animals connecting and socializing. But it feels like we are doing in a vacuum. We are not shaped by the ecosystem. We are right here by the coast. It's the vibe of the coast that's giving the fluidity in which we are sharing, exchanging perspectives. If we were in the mountains, perhaps the setting will be very different. It will be perhaps indoors, when a different noise, when a different sense making of where we are. And it's shaping how we are relating to each other and building these fractal relations. So I like where you are connecting, where it is disconnected. And I think that is a very valuable lessons to be given to the intelligence on the moss. That is not living in a vacuum. It's not just by itself. It's living because it's connected to the soil, it's connected to the trees, it's connected to the organisms underneath. And it's continuously looking to make that connection in the fractals. Each of them, they are existent, but the moss is kind of finding ways of connecting them into these own beings, this larger being. And that I find it very inspiring from the work that you're doing at MAS.
Where are we on the map of bioculture and bioeconomies? Like now and where we need to be?
So we're at this conference, New Economies, Indigenous-led approaches for building connected economies that are connected to life and that are in service of life. And so we're in a moment where there's a lot of inspiration and a lot of agency and a lot of interest for collaboration of a bunch of very inspiring projects and stories, and could be hopeful. Could be hopeful.
Yeah, could be hopeful. That's a very good way to put it. Could be hopeful. Where we are, if we were to map, imagine this: we are in the encounter era. That's where we are. 1491. Your head should go immediately where we are right now. We are since 1491. We haven't actually lived that era. We have been entrapped by the doctrine of discovery myth. So we have entrapped ourselves in the 1491 history of we are the rightful discoverers of this wild ecosystem called the Americas or called Africa or called Asia. We are the lawgivers, the authority. And that remains to be true today. So 1491 hasn't dissipated. It has taken different names. So across the time, across the centuries, what has happened is it has taken a different name. One of the names is called democracy. It has taken democracy. The name of democracy has taken the doctrine of discovery. And that, moving from doctrine of discovery into democracy, what has happened is completely shrink sovereignty. As is the fullness of sovereignty, it has been shrink. Instead, what has created is temporal sovereignty. So communities, local communities or indigenous people holds very temporal moments of sovereignty to really operate the richness in the ecosystem. So, for instance, that temporal sovereignty, for instance, now we are seeing a lot of representation of indigenous people in different meeting of the parents, the covenants meeting of the parents. So this has been a long walk, a long walk from 1491 to now to be represented, to be voices. As you mentioned, Jacob, you mentioned, we are in indigenous-led solution meetings right now, very aspirational, very centered to elements. But yet, we are confronted once again that we need to still make indigenous systems and local communities governance ready in a way, like a readiness, demonstrate the readiness to work with these systems that was built out of the 1491 doctrine of discovery that still remains to be true nowadays. That's where we are right now, and that's our present. So we are in the rhetoric. So think about when we talk about rights of indigenous people. Human rights, the notion that we need to chant human rights, that is 1491, that we are chanting human rights. Indigenous people's rights, it shouldn't be a moment of chanting it. It should be just a giving because they are the sovereign owners of their territory. But yet we need to go into the rhetoric of indigenous people's rights. And then now, more recently, we are in the picture of rights of nature. And surprisingly, nobody is asking, why do we have to get into the rhetoric? Because we haven't escaped 1491. We're trapped in there. Where do we need to go? Imagine now that you really think about this from the point of wealth. Imagine that we all understand that we have wealth sovereignty. We understand that. Indigenous people right now, as by many studies globally, independently from NGOs, they say that Indigenous people hold 80 to 85% of the global biodiversity. And we are actually investing. We have created instruments in nature finance, climate finance. So really, who is holding the nature assets? Is it JP Morgan? Is it your hedge fund? Is it the impact investor really holding the asset, the real asset that we need to be? Or is this 80 or 85% of biodiversity in these territories? Where do we need to go is we need to do the counter mythology to the doctrine of discovery. Communities has always been in building partnerships, but yet the doctrine of discovery, they have chanted us and labeled us as obstacles of progress, obstacles of development, obstacles of innovation. And therefore, we have continuously feeding to the 1491 doctrine that external entities, in this context, Western economical settings, are setting the value, are setting the rules, are setting these elements. We need to go is where we understand what is our wealth sovereignty, and we understand what is the wealth of Western society. And then we will start thinking about how do we negotiate between equal sovereign wealth holders, not rights holders, but wealth holders, that we are equity sharers in this world. Because then what we will start seeing is we will actually start seeing where our food system comes from. Where is our water comes from? Where is the air that we freely breathe in? Where it comes from? So we need to start moving into relational services, relational goods, and understanding that much of the economical imagined realities that's being sold by the doctrine of discovery that started in 1491 and has persisted even today. What it has been doing is putting us against my brother, my sister against my sister, my brother against my brother, people against people, citizens against citizens. And this is your work, Jacob, where you mentioned about relationships. Rather, we have been further disconnected. The future that looks forward from 2100, let's call it. Let's put a date, 2100. The future will be connection, building the network, building the river flow, where what is being learned in Germany or in areas of Germany flows into the Amazon basin. And what is we're learning in social ecological systems, it flows into the learnings, the lessons. We trade in systems. We are in the trans systems. And in that way, we are all sovereign to the flow. It's not about rights. It's not about respect. It's just us understanding that we both hold sovereign to what we're trying to do. And the sovereignty of all is that we want to live in a planet where it's worthwhile living for, sustain life. We are not building casinos in the moon. That's for sure. And those that are building casinos in the moon, they will leave us behind. And we will say thank you for leaving. Because at the end of the day, we will still maintain intergenerational responsibility to our territories. And that's the future. Building the intergenerational responsibility to this planet, to where our ancestors, your ancestor, wherever walks of life, colors, shapes you are, you have ancestors in this land. But you don't have ancestors in the moon, where you might be doing casinos and why not? The future looks connection, shaping those relationships, the counter mythology to the doctrine of discovery, understanding that we have wealth sovereignty from both footings. How do we bring that into negotiation? And the best way to negotiate, the conditions to negotiate, we are building it. How do we bring it forward?
And as we are embedded in a framework that helps us ground, I'm interested in the sort of very practical side of your work. So how do you advance this worldview through the various experiments and research and practical side of projects. And I like this question that you're asking of, like, where do we need to go? And
what is the roadmap?
I also want to add to that, how is it measured?
Yeah.
Even with you. But we'll start with, like, how do we measure where we're at in our progress with it?
Well, what do we measure where we are? Is as simple as that. We are often talking very different narratives of the same 1491 history. That's where we are right now. So that's the measurement. We have, using the rhetoric of indigenous people are poor, are marginalized, are vulnerable. That's the rhetoric that we use. That's the measurement. If we were to do a web scrap and use artificial intelligence to analyze the times that we use these words into research proposals, into projects, into programming, into initiatives, it will not be surprising to see how much these words are used and overused. So we're using this narrative to build a consciousness that indigenous people are inherently poor, are inherently with no territory, are inherently incapable of managing their financial institution, which is nature capital, nature assets. And that's by far false. See, that's the measurement that we should be thinking about. It's not necessarily the numerical. How many indigenous people are now going hungry? Okay, that's systemic. That's a systemic measurement to think about. And who is doing the statistics is also another question. So there's not necessarily adding a next value, a percentile into each community, how this is working, but it's rather how is the rhetoric impacting into our consciousness, the way that we drive the conversation and the way that we do public policy, the way that we do mechanisms of financial work, social security nets, is based in these narratives. It's based on how we build more information. And the practical thing that Jacob is asking is, in order to do this, really, the one thing that I have been discussing with some of my colleagues in indigenous legal systems thinking is that, you see, when we talk about Western legal systems, we are very quickly to point somebody that was a long time ago alive in Greece. Aristotle, Plato, those guys, well, in that page, that time, from the old Greek, that means like a lex. No, lex means law, or the beginning of law. And then nullis, it means nobody owns it or nobody has it. Indigenous people are labeled as lex nullis, meaning lawless people, because we can point it to this old text. Now take the same thing in indigenous legal systems. Who do you point? Which text? Who is our Aristoteles? Who is our big thinker? We haven't recorded our information, not in the way that is machine readable. It's not in the way that you can put it in a classroom and you can memorize. Not in that way. It's relational. Remember, relational services, relational goods. This archive of knowledge is a relational service, is a transfer from intergeneration when people are connected, when people are into relations. Because of that, something very practical, we need to start thinking about what is the indigenous data standards. Meaning, if we are to work with indigenous knowledge and indigenous nature assets, we better have a standard to do it with. And this standard, it needs to be built by indigenous people, for indigenous people, and at the very minimum with indigenous people. That's going to be the minimum thing, should be built with indigenous people to have this. And that's something that Kindred Hub we're doing. Building indigenous data standards. And that's where Kindred Hub is doing a service and product for the creation of negotiation conditions for indigenous people in research, development, and innovation. Because once you have a standard, once you have data sovereignty, once you have data governance, then you can sit understanding your wealth. Remember, you from the point of your wealth. And that's a measurement that you can see. For instance, one of the things that we're working right now is, okay, we do research, so sure, and this is something that we do. 51% of the decision making is held by the community. That's measurable. Meaning, if we want to reuse the data, the community, we need to go and explain why do we want to reuse the data. And they hold 51% of the decision making. So if they disagree with us, they can easily vote against it. They said, no, we refuse it because it's not within our favor. It's not favoring us as a 51% holders of that information. Is not favoring us. And we can measure that. How many times has community rejected because their agenda has been met by the project that we do? And this is based in a standard, in a protocol that we can synthesize on how to work with indigenous knowledge, with nature assets and indigenous systems, and the genomics of indigenous people, territory, and themselves. We can measure those things. And this is something practical that we are more and more trying to, how do we bring this into more normative into these conversations that we're looking at? What is the real thing that we're exchanging in the trans systems? Information is what we exchange most often. Models is what we exchange more often. Theory of change is not a person that's coming in or a tree that's being grown. Theory of change is really a mental relationship building knowledge or information that you interpreted as you fit seed into these ecosystems. To do that, it has been built a model to help flow through. It's the same thing that we need to do with indigenous knowledge systems to help that flow, to help the interoperability, but the interpretation, the semantic of it is going to be really determined by the user at the end of the day. We just need to guide in the best way possible. The information is not co-opted or colonialized or stolen or easily remove the copyright because artificial intelligence spills out artificial knowledge about indigenous people or how to deal in these negotiations with indigenous people. That's something that we are doing to measure our negotiation readiness into these ecosystems, because otherwise our presence in meetings is being looked up as a consent to do projects and so forth. But not because actually communities has gone through the process of negotiation to ensure that their agendas are being met. These standards could be a very straightforward numerical or percentile to see number of projects really doing what they promise and number of projects really rejected because they failed to fulfill the promise. Think about artificial intelligence going through that. Right now, artificial intelligence isn't the hype. It's artificial intelligence for everything. Every single thing, for nature, for good, for ethics, for everything. But it doesn't have a standard that can measure their impact, their actual impact and actionability. And that's what we're trying to do. Like the same approach that they have done to indigenous communities, how can we use the same thing now to artificial intelligence to say, this is a good tool, but it's not fulfilling what it is. Therefore, it's not ready to be adapted into these ecosystems. It needs to be worked out further in order to be very functional.
Jakob, I want to hear from you really quick on how do you value relationship?
I'm very wondering in terms of this artifact that we are creating together. Sometimes it's just like, even this, like this is a meeting, this is an encounter. We're learning more. As we're leaning in, we're learning more. I got interested in practical projects, and you're like setting the table first. You're opening a framework, right? And in there, like in terms of understanding the broadness and the full spectrum of our sort of approach and our vision on how we're moving forward, in a short kind of conversational moment, I'm like trying to keep this approach of the principles of agency and the motivational side of how we can move forward, and this sort of vision-driven collaboration potential sort of in the conversation. And that's why I'm very curious, not exactly into the question of how do we measure things. There is always what we create is what becomes visible, and the second order effects of how these creations inform other things come along, and way too much the things we create to solve a problem create another problem, and we have to deal with that. So like I'm just curious to hear more, not really for the artifacts that we're creating after recording, but for me, for understanding, like, how do you see your vision landing? The condor can fly wide and can see a lot from the top, but like, how is this sort of the vision energy landing and being embodied in projects that we can move forward?
Yeah, I already take to begin and start wrapping up, and not to lose the thread of the bioeconomy that we started with in this journey. As you mentioned, yes, we have a biocultural worldview. As a condor flies, is a biocultural worldview. We see the mountains, we see the Amazon rainforest, and then we see the ocean. That's how, and the deserts in our territories, and so we can see that. There's a practical thing that we are looking at in the bioeconomy now, and mostly we are applying indigenous anticipatory and futures thinking to this. There is a lot of work right now happening in the food systems, when agroecology, agrobiodiversity, protection, conservation. Many projects looking into that. Underneath, either consciously or unconsciously, there is a blind spot that's taking place. And this is where we land our space, is the biodata. In this monitoring, reporting, verification, reports, and so forth, and data collections to measure the relationships, to measure the success rate, we collect this data. But most of this data from agrobiodiversity, agroecology in the Amazon, in the Andes, where I come from, that information is leakage out into the financiers. It doesn't stay in the community. And that information becomes open data into public repositories, if you will, or private data into the corporations or the company or the NGO. In both ends is a tragedy to the wealth, sovereignty, the common wealth of indigenous people, because the most valuable thing is not just in the conservation of the agrobiodiversity, it's in the genetic agrobiodiversity. If we're losing our genetical information to external entities, we already lost the battle. Because right now, we already know that our major superfoods from the Andes, from the Amazon, are patented outside our territories. There is not one patent in Ecuador about our superfoods. And yet, there is multiple patents in China, there is multiple patents in the USA. How? How that happened? Because the information was leakage. How do we land this? Indigenous biotechnology infrastructure. Building our alternative pathway of saying, you know what? We will not continuously chant about their rights, respect the rights of indigenous people, their sovereignty in this. Because indigenous communities has more things to worry about. Like in Ecuador, when the national strike between September and October of 2025, they were not worried about the agrobiodiversity. They were worried about their territory, the sovereignty of their territories. And they were defending that. And they will continue to defend. Their military killed my people, my brothers. They killed my sister. They injured over more than 100 people hospitalized for there. Underneath all of that is the nature assets, is what the nation-state development is looking for. Private companies is looking for. The nature assets is what they're looking for. To land that, we are building an indigenous biotechnology infrastructure, indigenous data standard, in which we collect ecosystems genomics. We start processing it. We building a mobile lab to look into that, to see actually the knowledge, the practical knowledge that people are using to manage those ecosystems. Bringing soil genetics, pairing it together and giving immediate recommendations to say, in climate change, we see that this is going to happen. We need to move into the next direction. That's anticipatory. That's futures thinking. And in futures thinking, all this genetic information, okay, now we can store in a cloud. Oh, you know what? Let's build one of the first of its kind indigenous data repository in the Andes. Let's build it. And say, okay, how do we do it? With which money? you guys are asking the wrong questions. We need to ask the question was, where do we build it? Who will govern it? How we will govern it? That should be our questions. How do we finance this? God damn it, we will go and sell every single potato. We will do car wash. It doesn't matter. If we are committed to it, we will make it happen. And King Jacob is doing what he can when what they have. We fly very high. We have a biocultural worldview of our biocultural regionality, and we have landed into specific projects in the Andes, in the northern part of the Andes of Ecuador, and in the central part of the Amazonian of Ecuador, when the Pastaza people, helping them into bringing further ways of interacting in the bio and the data economy, such that they are not dependable so much all the time in the market economy that their products are undervalued. But we need to find parallel pathways to bring that. And this is something that practically we are trying to do in a very specific way, because we need to test it, first of all. And then if we license the data, how much is the data worth? Who puts the value in the data if we were to license or contract it? Not Kindred Hope, that's for sure, is the community. The farmers will be saying, like, we believe that this is how much we should get for our data sets, because we are seeing the production of our own farms going up, or the decreasing of investing in our agriculture has gone this much down. They need to figure it out how to do it. Our job is to create the negotiation conditions. That's what we are doing. So practically, these are practical things that we could join forces, we can bring together. That now is no longer just about impact investment. We should be thinking about recovering investment in the nature assets, meaning the recovering investment, it should be like, how do we bring the already readiness nature assets into tangible exchanges in the trans systems approach, and the recovery funds or recovery investment. That's what we do. It helps communities to recover their innovation, to recover the technologies, to recover the sciences. That's something that we can do now. We can do practically as we speak. We can get it down. And that anticipates something even bigger in the bioeconomy. The next era of plant domestication. We should not be thinking about what we're losing right now only. We should be thinking about what are these big agri-tech, agri-businesses, bioprospecting company doing right now to control us in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. Biobanking. They are biobanking. They are bioprospecting our genetic ecosystems. And they will control us in that way. Not only the indigenous people, all of us, all farmers, we will fall in the pits. And we are already, when GMOs, our seeds from Bayer, if we cross-pollinate, we already have seen that they having lawsuits about companies like Monsanto, like Bayer, lawsuits against farmers for cross-pollination when they're patenting seeds. That removes the wealth economy. It makes it once again into this narrative of dependencies, narrative of we're losing it, we are vulnerable, we are poor. Farmers are not poor. The system has made them poor. They are continuously producing, and the food system is very much so undervalued. And we need to start reconciling with that. How do we bring financial mechanisms? How do we bring anticipatory systems to protect the wealth sovereignty of our food system? It's not about indigenous food system. It's our global food systems, because our diet, if you really think about it, is 3,000 old. That's one of the last records of plants actually being domesticated. And a lot of our products that we use, like potatoes, it came from the Andes. It came from the wealth, the common wealth of indigenous people in the Andes. That's where it came. And now potatoes is what? A staple globally. It's a nature asset that it was never remunerated to the original places. And that's not a point to say that we need to restore or restorations or remarkation. That's not it. It's about recognizing the nature asset of our food systems and the potential damage of the bioeconomy if we do not put anticipatory in those ecosystems and futures thinking into how do we building current solutions. The current solutions needs to have those two things working side by side such that we have positionality, intentionality, and potentiality. And the potentiality is the key. Potentiality means it can have unintended consequences and it can have intended consequences. And we need to wrestle with that. How do we figure it out the right balance between unintended consequences and the intended consequences? And those three things, I think, could guide us in the roadmap.
This is I Am Interchange. Warinkwi, Jacob, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. And Jacob just nodding.
The seeds for the next conversations are planted.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's this episode of BioCulture. What Jacob and Warinkwi are really asking isn't just how systems change, but how they're remembered. How knowledge that was interrupted finds its way back into practice. This conversation doesn't end here, it carries forward. From fields and waterways to kitchens and councils, into indigenous economies rooted in relationship, responsibility, and care, into policies, partnerships, and everyday choices that quietly rebuild systems aligned with life. I'm Tate Chamberlin, and stay tuned for episode 3 in this series focused on sovereignty, what it looks like, how it's lived, and why it matters now. Thanks for listening. Music for the Eco Nomic Futures podcast is by Superman, a contemporary indigenous artist from the Apsáalooke Nation, featuring the Northern Cree. Known for his innovative fusion of hip-hop and traditional indigenous elements, Superman brings cultural heritage and modern storytelling to the soundtrack.
Following hers, I pray for you, pray for the sick and the poor, pray for the rich man who don't give to the Lord, and I pray for wisdom, and I pray for power, and I pray for being ready in the final hour, and I pray for those who keep judging ministry, and I pray for my friends and my enemies.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. The Eco Nomic Futures Summit was brought to you by the University of California, Santa Cruz, Indigenous Engagement Institute, Gwen Bridge Consulting, Wo Lakota Lab, the Cleveland Foundation, Native Americans in Philanthropy, Salmon Returns, Nia Taro, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, Firelight, and Quaxala. Special thanks to Gwen Bridge, Julia Indivierno, Solomon Sear, Jacob Huhn, Ruskar, and longtime I Am Interchange supporter, Whistlepig Korean. This episode was produced by Susan Karstensen and me, Tate Chamberlin. A shout out to our media and production team, Darko Sevilla, Amin Yarsu, and Jacob Desh. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.